everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, especially in the aftermath of that all of us within the last hour regarding the guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. We are here today to talk about cannabis legalization. There was a fantastic bill that just passed in New York, and I'm so excited to be here with Joe, who is part of Vocal New York, an organization that was instrumental in campaigning and pushing for this bill that recently got passed. And we debated whether to move forward with this live stream. We had this scheduled before we obviously knew that this was going to be a moment where we all just received this very heavy news. And yet we decided to move forward because we see these issues as intimately related. And so we're going to get into that, but we also just want to hold space to just acknowledge that we all just received this very complicated update about kind of the state of this case. And so, Joe, I want to give you space to acknowledge and just share a little bit about how are you feeling in this moment? Are there any immediate reactions you want to share? And I'll do the same, but I also want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. And then as we go through the conversation, we'll get into some of the connections that we see to this particular case and what we're here to talk about.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Joe. I work at Vocal New York. For folks who don't know, Vocal is a 20-year-old organization that's been fighting to end mass incarceration, the drug war, homelessness, and HIV and AIDS in New York State. So obviously, we're feeling a lot of emotions at the announcement of this verdict. I think that, first and foremost, we hope that there is, some semblance of peace for the families, and that, that this is in line with what, they were hoping to see. I think for us, we have spent a lot of time as an organization trying to communicate to folks who have never, dealt with issues of drug use, who've never dealt with incarceration or increased policing or police violence. These are systemic problems. They exist on a system-wide basis, and really it's a choice about how the government addresses the problems people face. And so George Floyd was a tragedy that was emblematic of things that our membership have faced in one way or another their entire lives. And so we I think need to take a long, hard look as a society about what justice means, and and how we can get to a place where we see really big shifts in the way that we deal with drug use, homelessness, poverty, and go away from carceral systems that sort of take away from people's dignity and humanity, and invest in things that are based in compassion and care.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I feel a form of intellectual relief that I can't feel in my heart, because intellectually, I'm surprised, to be honest, that the verdict was returned as guilty on all counts, because this is the exception at this point, not the rule, right? And we've seen that play out over and over and over again. And it's heavy on my heart that even as George Floyd's family was grieving the loss of a son, brother, father, cousin that they'll never get back, they were enduring a defense that tried to discredit or paint what happened as anything less than murder, by touching on the potential alleged past drug use or things like that. And that the pretext for this murder was a $20 allegedly counterfeit bill, right? And these are fundamentally issues of the way that we understand criminalization, the way that we understand how to respond to these issues in our society. And as you said, how we choose to respond. And so I think that, and then not only were they enduring that kind of smear campaign from the defense, they endured the publicizing and committing of multiple additional murders by police just in the midst of that trial alone, right? When we think about Adam Toledo and several others who we either were made aware of the videos, right? And many of us watched additional similar murders by police of our community members, or they happened in the middle of the time, in the midst of that time. And so, in this moment, I think that those things for me highlight this sense of clarity that I have no judgment for anyone who feels relief. And like you said, my heart is with George Floyd's family. I hope that they do feel some sense of relief, or like kind of step towards the ability to find peace in the aftermath of this. And yet, clear that just in what we've seen in the midst of the trial indicates that one conviction could never actually address the problems that we need to address so that we can have true justice, which is that our people are alive and thriving, right? So I just think that is, I just want to send love and shout outs to a lot of my friends in movement who I know are feeling a lot of complicated feelings. And on top of that, a lot of pressure about how you show up, how you speak, what you say in this moment. And just to say that however you feel in this moment and in the aftermath of this is okay. And that you don't owe anyone a performance of emotion or of action in the aftermath of something like this, that you get to take the space that you need to grieve and to feel however you feel. And so often I think a lot of us are made to feel like we do have to perform in these moments. So, wanted to say all of that on the top. And also, I do want us to get into talking about some of those systemic changes are needed, some of this progress toward that has been made recently, and talk about what's possible for that society that we envision, where we have systems that are actually rooted in our dignity and humanity and safety. So, to that end, Joe, tell us a little bit about this bill that recently passed and what it means in terms of some of moving us towards some of those systemic changes and why it's so important.
Yeah, so I think that the first thing for folks who don't know sort of the history of this movement and this fight, there has been a longstanding progressive call to legalize marijuana in New York State. It picked up a lot of steam after other states started to go forward with their own legalization plans. And so last year or 2 years ago, before COVID, the sort of last regular legislative session, there was a lot of fighting between the progressive movement and the governor, who, really wanted to pass a version of marijuana legalization that was modeled more after what other states had been doing, versus, the MRTA, which is ultimately what passed and was, a bill that is designed to address the harms that were caused by the drug war. And so I think that there's a lot of really specific choices in that bill that, are key and should be sort of seen as models for the rest of the country and for legislation on a federal level. But I also think one of the lessons here is that, there were a lot of points in this campaign where people felt like there was a need to compromise with the governor and to just get something passed that was, very different than the bill that we ultimately got. And I think that this is a good sort of reminder of, when organizers stick to the principles that are guiding the work that they do, they can actually win a lot more than they think that they're going to. And had we compromised with the governor earlier on in this process, a lot of the good that this bill does would not have happened. So specifically, I think that the things that this bill does right are, it has a strong focus on expunging convictions, and undoing the harm that the drug war did for years and years and years. If you look at a place like Colorado, if you had a felony conviction for dealing or using drugs, you were excluded from the marketplace that was created through legalization. You weren't allowed to, get a license to sell legal pot. So, I think that the shift from that mentality of, right, like we're going to create, a system, a business system, a licensing system so that we can get this to make money as quickly as possible for the state. And rather than doing that, say, well, who was harmed by this and how do we make sure that their records are clean, that they can benefit from this, was the first and foremost priority of this bill. The other thing is that, we understand that as long as the police are operating under a quota system, wherein they have to make a certain number of arrests in certain communities in order to, succeed in their job, quote unquote, they're going to find ways to arrest people for marijuana. And so really identifying every single way in which a cop might get someone, in cuffs in a station, even temporarily, just to meet that quota, was key, right? So making sure that it was legal everywhere that tobacco was legal, making sure that a cop couldn't stop somebody who was smoking a cigar and claim that it was a blunt and then put them in jail for 24 hours was a sort of key thing that was baked into the bill. And then the final thing that I think really gets to, all of it does, but I think, but in a different way, it gets to the issues of sort of policing and how the state chooses to spend its money is the tax revenue that's going to be created, right? We know this is going to end up being $1 billion industry. It's going to create, a lot of money for the state of New York, and the priority for that money needs to go beyond whoever is sitting in the governor's chair, right? It really needs to be invested in the communities that have been harmed by these policies. The drug war started in 1914, so it's been over 100 years of, devastation to people who, use and interact with people who use. But that's not going to be solved overnight. And there's going to need to be decades of funding for social programs to undo a lot of the harm that was done by that. So, I think for those three reasons alone, we really think that the MRTA is the gold standard piece of legislation, and it should be the model for other states, for the federal government as they pursue this. We also think that this is one step in a very, very long path towards ending the drug war. And I think that we often think about this idea. It's called the iron law of prohibition, which is basically every time you prohibit a substance, a more dangerous version of that substance is created. And so if you're interested in harm reduction, if you're interested in saving lives of people who, use drugs, then prohibition really never makes any sense. And so I think, we are looking towards the decriminalization of all drugs, and beyond that, we're looking to figure out, what is a way we can decarcerate this system, and do it in a way that puts money back into the communities that were harmed by the incarceration in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely have spoken on the dynamics of prohibition, but I've never heard that phrase, the golden rule of prohibition. And that's really helpful as a way to remember this kind of dynamic that we're contending with when we pass laws that ostensibly people pass with good intentions, right? Like they're at least sold to us in this way, that is like, this is for our community's safety, right? This is a theme that we talk about a lot. Me being a veteran, right, who I talk a lot about how I believed that I was going to go do all of these great things and fight for freedom, because that's what we tell our youth, right? That's what we say in our movies and our ads. And yet it took me learning the hard way, seeing with my own eyes the kind of truth of the catastrophic harm, to the point where I said, it doesn't actually matter what the intentions of this were, right? What matters is that we are unquestionably doing so much harm than good, both to our own troops and to people overseas who we supposedly invaded this country to help, right? According to kind of the Laura Bushes of the world. But I think that, that same logic, for me, I see so many connections, right? In this logic of like, we're doing these things to make our communities more safe, to care for people who need our help, right? And yet we end up, in truth, unleashing so much harm in those communities. So what are some of the arguments that you believe people were making in good faith against legislation like this, and kind of what would you say to them, right? The people who are concerned that this will escalate potentially, right? Like the harms that they perceive around drug use. How do you all discuss that in community as you were building and organizing and advocating for this legislation or legislation like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was a big part of the campaign. I think there are a lot of people who spent, years of their lives believing one thing about drugs and had to become to convinced about another thing. I think that, one message that we want to send really clearly is there's been a massive cultural shift. It's undeniable around marijuana in the last 30 years, and people coming to understand, the harm that the drug war has done in enforcing that piece of legislation. What we would push really fervently is that exists for every drug. That exists for prohibition as a concept, and for people need to understand that the drug war goes far beyond their community, right? The drug war is an international enterprise to destabilize whole countries and to cause mass death and violence to the people who live there. So there's a tendency to think about problems until you can't see them. And I think that we deal with a lot of problems in society that way. How do you deal with the homeless guy on the street? Well, you put him in a shelter across town. How do you deal with the kid who's smoking weed in my hallway? Well, you put him in a jail across town, right? As long as we can't see it, it's not really there. But the effects of the drug war are really far-reaching, right? And I think that the drug war was designed specifically to target Black communities, to target communities of color, to destabilize, parts of Latin America that the United States wanted more economic influence over, and to create a narrative that when someone is sick, when someone is, in a bad way, that the police violence in general is the appropriate response, right? I actually think that there was a lot of unlearning that people had to do to come to accept a system wherein, if someone is overdosing on the street, the response should be to throw them in jail, right? If I see someone overdosing on the street and I call 911 and try to have someone save their life, that I should be thrown in jail. But we need to come to terms with the fact that that's the reality, in many states across this country. And for up until very recently, due to in part work that Vocal did, it was the reality in New York City. So I think that there's a long path forward into undoing a lot of the harm that the drug war did. I think that, one of the things that we were concerned about is that people will start to create differentials in their mind, right? And I think this happened with the George Floyd case. This is, the big defense that people were using, at least in the media, was, well, there was fentanyl in George Floyd's system. And I think that people create these sort of boogeymans for themselves. They say, well, okay, well, it's okay. A couple people want to smoke pot. That's fine. No harm, no foul. But fentanyl, this is a really evil thing. This is, something that we really need to put a stop to. And there's just not really consistent logic there. People die from using drugs. That's true. More people will die this year than ever before. We expect over 100,000 deaths from overdose in America this year. We are at year 114 of the drug war. So there's really been no correlation between the amount of violence we put out into the world to try to stop people from using drugs and saving anybody's life. And what we need to acknowledge is that many people were that using a harm reduction model, promoting policies that encourage people to use safely, and to use in a way that's more sustainable is what saves lives. It is what reduces overdoses. And so if that's the goal, then that's what we need to do. If the goal is to disappear people, if the goal is to create an excuse to criminalize a certain portion of the population, the drug war is working just fine.
Yeah, really well put. Yeah, because I do think because we've just been kind of fed this logic and this like solution, right, or approach for so long. I grew up with these DARE classes that made drugs seem like these horrifying, scary, right? And as an adult, I've learned just like point blank untruths that I was taught, right? Things that are just factually inaccurate in programs like that. And yet a lot of us have only been exposed to those things if we've gone looking for it, right? So a lot of us are still carrying around a lot of this information that is just not true anymore. And I mean, you bring up fentanyl and in the city by this overdose crisis and this tragedy of our young, especially our young members of our communities dying. And a lot of that, correct me if I'm wrong, I went to a Narcan training Narcan is the brand of a drug that you can inject when someone is facing an opioid crisis, overdose, that could potentially save their lives in the moment, right? And so I, as part of I try to stay up on my just community medicing training, and I went to a training as a part of that a community group was operating, and they told me that actually a huge percentage of those overdoses are not necessarily because of an opioid, the way that we would think of it, like heroin or something like that, but because of fentanyl being laced in people's supply, right? That it has been particularly deadly and has been a huge driver. And so when we think about the logic of this, right? Like I'm trying to think about just the explicit logic of saying, well, I mean, essentially, right, what the defense attempted to say in the trial, in a way, right, it was an insinuation that somehow George Floyd brought this on himself by having this chemical in his system that often people are not even intentionally taking, right? And that the solution to that should be violence against them, whether it's by a police officer on the spot or throwing them in a jail, right? Like just going to a jail is a traumatic experience for people. And when we think about the relationship between trauma and sometimes drug use, right? Not always. I want to be clear on that, right? That it's not always a coping strategy. It's not always unhealthy or addiction, right? Sometimes it is though. Like how, right? Like, so our solution to a concern about addiction is to further traumatize people and treat them as criminals who are as if they're trying to harm others, right, in our community. And just on its face, that logic doesn't make sense to me, right? It just seems like something so obviously disconnected from our goals, the goals that you're laying out, the goals I think a lot of us agree with. So, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to this place? You've mentioned the war on drugs a few times. I want to encourage folks to check out books. The book that really expanded my understanding and thinking on this was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, in understanding this from a systemic place. But Joe, I'm curious if you feel up for sharing with folks a little bit about the history of like, what is the war on drugs? What do you mean when you say that? Kind of what are some of the things when you say, I know that there are concrete examples of kind of what you said around the war on drugs being intentionally targeted towards Black and Brown community. But for folks who don't know about those things, like what do they need to know to really understand what we're talking about at a systemic level here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think a brief overall history, the first time anyone used the phrase war on drugs was, again, like I said, over 100 years ago. It was in 1914, and it was directly connected to a lot of the same things it's connected to now, right? There were a deep sense of nationalism, of xenophobia, of a need to control certain portions of the population, and a need to find a mechanism to justify all that. And throughout the course of the 20th century, at different points, the war on drugs has been reiterated. So Richard Nixon comes out and says, we're declaring a war on drugs, and Ronald Reagan does a very similar thing. Bill Clinton does a very similar thing. They are all reiterating the same policy. They're all pushing the same agenda, and the agenda really is, how can we create a way to police the people in the society we already don't like? And so what the war on drugs really has accomplished is a massive destabilization of not only communities in the United States, but also internationally, right? And I think, one of the things that we tend to lose sight of a little bit in America is being really unbelievable amounts of violence that the war on drugs generates overseas. And so that, like, when we think about the really violent wars that the United States has been engaged in the 21st century, obviously Iraq, Afghanistan are what comes to mind. But if you look at the sheer number of lives lost, right up there is the war on drugs, right? And the number of people who have been either murdered directly by efforts to stop the flow of drugs by the United States, or people who have been murdered because the drugs are illegal. Any way you slice up the numbers, you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of thousands of unsolved homicides south of our border. So I think that what people really need to think about, like, I actually think thinking about these in this big systemic way is important, and it's good context for us to understand why a lot of this happened. I think for individual people, I'm from Bay Ridge. I grew up in Bay Ridge and Staten Island. I grew up around a lot of cops. I grew up around people who would be really, really horrified to hear you say, we should be giving clean needles to people on the street, let alone we should be giving heroin to people on the street. Mm-hmm. But, I also grew up with a lot of people who use heroin. And I think that if I think about what I would want for those people, and for the people I've lost through an overdose, and I take something like fentanyl for a pretty clear example. It's terrifying to me that someone I love might, buy something with fentanyl in it and not understand that that's what it was and use it and an overdose. At Vocal, that happens, in our membership frequently, and it's a tragedy every time it does. But I don't want to see a member of my family given a 30-year mandatory minimum because of fentanyl. I don't think that would help them. What I would much rather them be able to do is go get those drugs tested, know exactly what's in it, know exactly what the risks are, know that there are going to be people on standby to give them Narcan, and to reverse an overdose. So it's really a choice, right, of how we spend the money, and how we address the problem. The path forward for something like fentanyl, where we put mandatory minimums on it, we make it far more illegal than other very similar versions of the same drug. And we spend a lot of money to violently try to enforce those measures. That's a well-trodden path. We've done that many, many times before, and it has never worked. And it has always made the problem far, far worse. What we have never tried is a real investment in harm reduction, is a real commitment to meeting people where they're at, and to get over our own individual, uncomfortableness or biases about people who use drugs, and really focus on a single goal, which is keeping people alive. And when you have that goal in mind, the justification for increased policing, for, mandatory minimums, for the targeting of people who use drugs by the police, it just gets harder and harder to justify that. If what your goal is to center people's dignity, to center their humanity, and to keep them alive.
Yeah. And to create safer communities, right, for our families and our kids. I mean, the connection, I'm not sure I fully closed the loops. I admittedly, I'm a little emotional in the aftermath of everything that just happened and a little all over the place myself. But the loop I want to close, to your point about fentanyl, is that we don't talk enough, I think, about the fact that a huge portion, if not all, of the overdoses that we're experiencing as part of this overdose crisis are a result of prohibition, right? Not necessarily the drug use itself. Because we can envision a scenario where people have support, right? Where they're not stigmatized and shamed and disrespected because they are either recreationally using drugs or because they're using drugs to cope, or because they were, they got addicted chemically, or psychologically. And I think that's right. I think it's important that we tie these effects to causes, and that the cause is this prohibition, is this social stigma that keeps people isolated and without the support that they need and deserve to be safe, to stay alive, right? This idea that, and that drives these kind of black market violences that we see as second and third order effects of essentially the black market that prohibition created, right? Like, we can lay that at the feet of those policies. So I think, I think that in talking about it, and what do we want for our kids that are struggling with addiction, what do we want for our neighbors and our family members, right, is super critical. I also, I think my personal connection to this is also, coming back to cannabis specifically. We've talked a lot in veteran community about the ways that the lack of access to things like cannabis legally contributes to this over-prescribing and overuse of opioids to cope with trauma, to cope with chronic pain, it really limits the options that are available to people in a way that is harmful, right? And fuels some of these issues. I just can't even tell you how many how many vets have said, I got a surgery after my deployment, or I got this, or I got that. And then I found myself addicted. And then they're also contending with all these stigmas and assumptions and all of these things that people have about how that happens, right? Or why that happens. So, I think that leads me to the next point of, this is great in New York. I always want people to be able to trust that I keep it real. So I'm just going to say, medical cannabis has been legal and accessible in New York for a while to some people. And I was able, as a vet, to access a medical cannabis license. And I was grateful for that, because I'm one of those people who was scared to buy on the street or be criminalized, given my family and being a person of color and where I live and all these things. I think I was scared to try to access that medicine. And it has helped me tremendously with sleep issues and other things. And so I know firsthand that that's true. And yet I'll admit, I'm still scared, even just saying that on this live stream, because it's still not federally legal, right? It's still federally criminalized. And I know that is a huge barrier for people, not just the veteran community. That's just the one I'm most intimately tied to, hearing stories on a day-to-day basis, right? Around, like, the VA can't prescribe cannabis right now. And so we know, right, like, there's literal studies at this point that have proven the benefits in helping treat PTSD and other issues that vets and other people face, right? And yet we have our premier medical care provider not allowed to give it to us, even though they know and we know it'll help us legally. And so what do you think are the next steps in terms of continuing to push this forward, Joe? And do you think that federal legalization is within reach? I'm certainly prepared to fight for it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that it is. I mean, again, I think that the medical marijuana, particularly in New York, is a really, really good example of something that we struggled with as an organization, right, for the last 20 years. So, when California passed medical marijuana, it was a thing that people really cared about in New York. We are an organization that was started by people with HIV and AIDS. And so, obviously a lot of people with HIV use medical marijuana for a wide variety of symptoms and treatments. We got a sort of rhetorical victory where the governor said, we support medical marijuana. And that was a thing that we hailed as a victory when it happened, but over the course of 2 or 3 years, as it was implemented, none of the people we worked with were ended up being able to access that program, right? That the program was designed in a way so that, if you were living on the streets, if you were using, other drugs, if you were in the shelter system, if you were very, very, very poor, you really didn't have access to medical marijuana.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a pathway forward for federal legalization, but I also think that, we definitely are taking a very somber lesson from this, which is like, it's worth taking the time to do these things in the right way, right? And, and that pushing back against the governor is possible, and that, getting the legislation laser focused on the people who are going to be most directly harmed by the policy is actually how you get it to do good. It would be a much sadder day if this was a bill that legalized weed for, white kids from Bay Ridge like me, but it was still de facto illegal for everybody else. And so I think that when we look towards a federal legalization, we got to think about, what are the sort of bare standards that we need in order for this to actually be helpful to people. I also think it's important that we tie it into, the larger fight against the war on drugs. Right. The federal government may pass weed. They are almost certainly going to pass laws to add a higher degree of illegality to fentanyl. They are going to almost certainly promote a narrative that, by targeting people who distribute fentanyl or manufacture fentanyl, that we are going to reduce the number of overall overdose deaths. Right. And so we need a cultural shift in our politics. We need people to recognize and acknowledge that what we've been doing for the last 100 years just does not work. Right. And every time, wine and beer in the prohibition turned into hard liquor, turned into wood alcohol that was killing people outright. The problem was the prohibition. Right. And so that has happened consistently over the years, that we've found some new drug and then can spin a narrative that it's uniquely harmful from other drugs. There are harm that come from drugs. That's true. That's why we call ourselves harm reductionists, right? Focusing ourselves on what actually helps people, what actually stabilizes people's lives and what actually gets them into a place where they can be, more dignified and live more fully. That doesn't look like police. That looks like needle exchange. That looks like Narcan training. That looks like, a housing first model where people are not regulated to the shelter and to the street. These are all policies that take time and money. And so the more time and money we devote towards, policing and locking people up and beating people up and shooting people, the less time and the less money and the less energy we have to actually do the stuff that works. So I think that, there's a pathway forward for marijuana. I think New York really needs to hail itself as a model. I think it's important for people to understand the differences between what New York has done, what Colorado did, and other states have done, and recognize the need to really center that New York model as we talk about legalization going forward. But I also think, if you're a person who has spent years thinking about, weed and why it should be legal and all the harm that the illegality of weed has done, I think it's a moment to start to think about the other aspects of this drug war, and how to get yourself involved with an organization like Vocal, where you can start to chip away, at the massive amount of infrastructure that goes into promoting violence and harm in our city, in our country, and then in the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one connection to that, right, is we were talking earlier about the connection between the war on drugs, legalization, and the murder of George Floyd. And, it's so clear to me, and I hope we can make it clear increasingly to others that there are so many ways. There's so many ways this is related, right? You were talking about some of the overseas things. One thing folks don't know is people love to get on the news, especially like pundits on Fox News, right, and say, oh, the incredibly violent, gun violence at the border. What isn't said is that as part of the war on drugs, we sold thousands and thousands and thousands of weapons into those communities. And those are directly tied to that gun violence that people are talking about, right? So just to make that point of the international impact super specific and clear, right? That's just one example. That when you hear folks talking about that border gun violence, those are literally a huge portion of those are guns that we sold to people. And so if we really want to solve this problem, we have to understand, right? We have to understand these cause and effect situation, these causes and effects. And then, similarly, the no-knock warrant that resulted in the murder of Breonna Taylor, right? Literally the creation of a no-knock warrant was on was in service of the drug war under this pretext of, well, these drug dealers, they will try to get rid of evidence if the cops come, so we have to surprise them. And we know that in order to transform, what we're really talking about is a new logic, right? A new logic at the root of how do we want to create safety for our communities in multiple different ways. But just again, another connection to, it's not just the immediate harm. It's all of these spin-offs that are created with the justification of something like the war on drugs, right? That so many of these things are spin-off effects of this kind of core logic that we know isn't actually working, isn't serving us, right? There's not just the opportunity to address overdoses, to address the effects of police violence directly on individuals in our community, under the pretext of addressing drug use, but also so many other structural ways that we meet, that we try to create safety with more violence. I think it's going to take some courage. I think that we have to step outside of these red versus blue talking points, right? so-and-so loves the police, so-and-so hates the police. It's just not really even about that. It really, in a lot of ways, is not about how you feel about police. It's about, like, do you want solutions? Do you want to actually achieve our goals of safe, healthy communities? And if you do, then we have to have the courage to admit when something's not working, and we know there's just evidence on evidence on evidence that this is not achieving our goals, right? And it's so all of that to say, I'm so glad that we are seeing the tides turn thanks to organizations like Vocal New York and so many out there. I want to just reiterate that even as we make this progress, one of the important things that we keep holding, and we certainly hold as we make progress, hopefully with federal legislation, is that we can't just legalize. We also have to make right all of those harms, right? And that's something really powerful that you all fought for in this bill in New York. And there's so much more to do, because even as we expunge records, right, there are people's lives who have been ruined by these laws. They've faced prison time, which means compounded traumas that will affect them and their families and their communities for the rest of their lives. And we have to be contending with that as well. So as we wrap up, I just want to encourage everyone to follow, join, become a part of Vocal New York and the incredible work that they're doing around several of the issues that our most vulnerable communities are facing. And Joe, what else do you want to make sure that people know before we kind of sign off? What else feels really important to leave folks with?
Yeah, I would say, I think that, we are at a real moment in the state of New York. I think that, there's been a really tremendously difficult year. And I think that the systems that we've had in place to provide service to people who are at the far margins of society are really cracking, and I think that people every day are seeing the evidence, right? In Bay Ridge, there are 4 food pantry lines every week that are overcrowded. And so I think this is really a moment for us to take a long, hard look about, what has been working and what has not been working about the society, and figure out how we can make some bold shifts in the way that we deal with these problems. I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think it's going to take a lot of courage. I think particularly for people in Staten Island and people in Bay Ridge, who for whatever reason have been involved in the processes of enforcing things like the drug war. We are not so far gone that it's too late for us to change these policies and to save people's lives. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of courage to reevaluating what you've been doing and the kind of services you've been providing, and making that kind of shift. But that's what's necessary now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you all have demonstrated incredible courage. I'm ready to have, I think that the courage that it takes to stand up and fight for everybody, including people who use drugs, recreational or out of need, and I invite all of us to really sit with this and really ask ourselves if we have the courage to do it, but to do the same, and to really build the community that I know that we all long for. I know that that's the common ground that we have. And so with that, thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Please share this on your social media. Check out, we've dropped links for Vocal New York in general, as well as a specific fundraising campaign that they have underway to advance some important campaigns that are upcoming. And, of course, as always, we continue to build this movement who do exactly that, to cultivate, or at least to have a representative that's willing to fight for the New York 11 that we believe is possible in the midst of so many people who have told us that we have to settle, that we have to just accept that, things are the way that they are. I don't believe that. I believe in us. So if you believe that as well, follow us, donate, sign up to volunteer, help us advance this work, whether, in whatever kind of atmosphere or organization feels right for you, but because there's a lot of places to plug in right now. And just, lastly, sending everyone so much love in this moment. Just, again, hearts go out to the families of people who have been harmed by all different types of police and state violence in the midst of this trial and verdict. And those of us who I know are trying to cope with this kind of violence in our communities and attend to people's needs in the midst of it every single day. And let's use that, take your time to grieve and feel what you need to feel, and then get plugged in, and let's fight for something better so that we don't have to keep grieving and keep mourning.